It's a conspiracy, man! The sea otters are in my walls! Oh hey, a new Happy Bara video! Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Den of the Drake. Other dragons hoard gold, while I hoard internet cringe. So, is it just me, or is Western culture kinda going through a bit of a writing crisis? Yeah, it kinda feels like the people who get paid to tell stories somehow got really bad at telling stories. Personally, I believe a big part of it is because a lot of modern writers aren't influenced by life experiences or an exploration of the world, they're influenced by media that already exists. In the past, if you wanted to make a character, you might have said, I want to create a character who is incredibly intelligent and capable, but has a massive ego, and his character development will be him learning to balance humility with his intelligence to bring about a better future. But the modern writer will just shrug his shoulders and say, OMG, I'm gonna make a character like Tony Stark. People love that guy, and that movie made a lot of money. Add in a heaping helping of political soapboxing approved by, air quotes, modern audiences, and you have yourself a modern classic that will be immediately dumped onto a streaming service where it will die a lonely and loathsome death. You'd think that this crisis of bad writing would be mostly localized to a specific part of California, but you'd be wrong, because this storm is less like a storm and more like a continent-spanning plague. Not even D&D is safe. Now, I will say that nobody expects your D&D character's backstory to be on par with the works of Tolkien, and there's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from existing media for your games and characters. D&D is really not meant to be taken that seriously, and the vision in your head probably will not look like the final product. But unfortunately, one of the main characteristics of these bad writers is that they take everything too seriously. The story I have for you today stars a player whose terrible writing habits lead him to creating one of the edgiest Mary Sues I've ever seen, which then leads to a tantrum of monumental proportions when someone dares to suggest that his precious baby boy might not be that precious. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right into the horrifying world of r/RPG horror stories. Enjoy. This week's story comes from Reddit user Routine Champion 152 and is titled Awful Wannabe Writer Makes Mary Sue Edgelord Character, then refuses to even play due to his own ego. Before I begin this story, I've a confession to make. Personally, I've always found edgy D&D characters, and the people who play them, to be rather fascinating. Mainly because I find it hilarious when people try to make these super cool lone wolf badasses, only for it to backfire on them in a hilarious fashion when they don't get their way, and no one can take them seriously, causing them to throw a temper tantrum. However, despite playing D&D for over 12 years and reading many RPG horror stories about them, I have never encountered a character like this in the wild. A friend of mine once played a pretty edgy character, an outcast drow wild magic sorcerer who got his magic due to being half demon. But he actually turned out really well and was loved by myself and all my other players. Mainly because he kept his edge at just the right level and had more character than just hating everything. However, a few months ago, it happened. Dear readers, allow me to introduce you to Damien Valdegar, Order of the Mutant Blood Hunter multiclass with a fiend-packed warlock. No, you didn't misread that. This is real. And, well, do I really need to say more? I'm obviously joking. You can absolutely have a blood hunter and warlock characters who are not edgelords. Same with any other class, it all depends on the execution. And I've personally seen characters with those exact subclasses both done brilliantly. But Damien and his player were just something else. Plus, I think he's indicative of a much deeper problem with the people who bring characters like this to the table. Brace yourself, reader, this is gonna be bad in the best way possible. So someone I knew, a guy I wasn't quite friends with but I'd known for about 4 years, mentioned to me that he was interested in getting into D&D. I offered to show him the ropes a bit, and after we set up a time to discuss things, I mentioned one of the things that we'd be discussing was character creation. To my surprise, he said that he already had a character and asked me if I could look at what he'd made and give him my thoughts. I agreed, but I have another confession. There was an ulterior motive to my actions here. You see, I've known this guy in writing circles, fanfiction specifically, and knew that he had a really bad habit of making Mary Sue characters who were basically self-inserts for whatever fandom he was writing about, including but not limited to Star Wars, Game of Thrones, and Harry Potter. And in said stories, he would rewrite and undo entire elements of the canon, either to make his OC the center of the universe or simply because he didn't like them. Usually both. For example, Game of Thrones fans, you know the Tyrion-Tywin dynamic? The rivalry that was so interesting and compelling, especially in the books, and that gave you insight into the mindset of two people that was rooted in how their upbringing shaped who they were, leading to so many great moments and a compelling payoff? Gone. In his fanfic, Tyrion and Tywin were buddy-buddy for no established reason, and there was no dislike between them at all, with Tywin even accepting Tyrion as his heir. Eat your heart out, Season 8. Also, his Star Wars OC takes Anakin's place as Palpatine's protege, then overthrows him and goes on to rebuild the Sith Empire. So, given this guy's track record, although to his credit he had been showing some small improvement over the years that I knew him, I decided to have a look at what he had made. Now, without wishing to sound too authoritarian, I was planning to see what he had come up with and if it would work in a D&D game fine. And if I felt it wouldn't, I was hoping to iron out the bumps and give some constructive feedback. And so, over a Discord chat, he introduced me to Damien. And it wasn't long before I knew that I had my work cut out for me. Damien was a wood elf with a soldier background, and his backstory was that he was a rough and tough orphan living on the streets of a capital city of an elven kingdom. So badass that he apparently killed a fully grown man in a fight when he himself was only 9 years old. He was found and taken in by a special forces unit of mutagen-using super soldiers, and trained to be one of them. And of course, he not only survived the ridiculously grueling training methods, but proved to be the best of them. Even becoming an officer and solo killing multiple dangerous monsters like trolls, mind flayers, beholders, and demons. Also, he gained a great deal of fame and became a local hero due to his first and most famous kill, 1v1ing a massive hydra, and then skinning the beast to wear its hide as a cloak. And all of this was before even starting the campaign. Then, as Damien grew into adulthood, the king himself took an interest in him, inviting him to the palace to speak with him. Turns out this guy was actually Damien's uncle, who had usurped the throne by murdering the previous king and queen, Damien's parents, and then tried to dispose of the prince but failed. He then tried to finish what he had started by sticking his personal guard on Damien, barely succeeding in bringing him down. After a fight scene where Damien killed all the guardsmen save 2, who would be mini-bosses in his personal storyline later on, and disposing of the Blood Hunter's body in a river. Damien didn't stay dead for long, though. As his soul lingered on the edge of the afterlife, he was approached by Bel, an outcast archdevil and former ruler of Avernus. He had taken an interest in Damien for his combat prowess, and apparently sympathized with him over having been usurped, as Bel had also suffered that humiliation. And so he proposed a deal: power and the chance for Damien to take back his birthright in exchange for allowing Bel to possess his body. Damien agreed and so rose from the grave, suffused with the Archdevil's power, and is now out to regain his throne and get revenge against his uncle. This has also changed him physically, apparently giving him sharpened teeth and eyes that, and I quote, "have lizard pupils that burn like hellfire." So to summarize, we basically have a stew made from mixing The Witcher's Geralt of Rivia, mutant monster slayer super soldier, Shadow of Mordor's Talion, dead warrior coming back to life due to being possessed by a magical being, Warhammer Fantasy's Malice Darkblade, elf and the demonic nature of his patron, and the Lion King's Simba, exiled prince reclaiming his kingdom from his uncle. Mixed together, served with a side of self-insert, and horrifically overseasoned with wannabe badass. Now, just to be clear, I'm not gonna go after the guy for taking inspiration from other characters. After all, let's not beat around the bush. We all know that that's a core part of D&D. Plus, I'm not sure he was even aware of Malice Darkblade's existence. Also, credit where it's due for him, he had actually done some research and actually chose what I thought was a mildly interesting patron. As far as I'm aware in the Forgotten Realms, Bel isn't actually cast out of the 9 hells, but an archdevil who might be doing this as part of a plan to gain his throne back. playing and manipulating Damien to seek power and pretending to sympathize with him after also having been deposed of his own position. Tons of potential there for an interesting warlock-patron dynamic if done right. However, I say this now because these are the only things I'm gonna cut him slack on, because this is where the problems get worse. So, going back to what OP said about lifting characters from other media being a core part of D&D, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. I can no longer count on one hand how many times I've made a cowboy gunslinger a la John Marston or Aaron Black. Because I'm a goddamn American, guns are cool, and the gunslinger is basically our version of the samurai myth. What more you want from me? That being said, however, I do think that people who just copy-paste existing characters from other pieces of media are doing themselves a bit of a disservice. A big part of D&D is the fact that, if done properly, the game is dynamic. People's personalities are shaped almost entirely from their experiences, and since the character you create in a role-playing game is pretty much a blank slate, you don't really know who this person is. I mean, sure, they have a backstory, but that's really supposed to be a reason for why the character is adventuring in the first place, and you aren't role-playing as that character during the events of their past. You're role-playing as them right now. Of course, there's a lot of caveats to what I just said, and results may vary, but often you really don't know who your character really is until you put yourself in the driver's seat and experience the events that the DM has prepared for you. It's a fun little mystery as you watch as your character forms like a wet piece of clay as they interact with other members of the party and the world they inhabit. When you come into a game with the attitude of, my character's like Han Solo, you kinda deprive yourself of that experience I just laid out. Because once the dust settles, you've saved the world and it's time to reflect on who your character turned out to be, your answer is just f***ing Han Solo. If you're not comfortable making completely original characters just yet, I recommend using existing characters as sort of vague blueprints, and then challenge yourself to add in character traits that vary wildly from the source material. That way you can be the happy little plagiarist that God intended you to be, but you also get to have some of the fun of a more original character. But don't cling on to the idea like it's your baby, because that's how you end up with creatures like Damien Valdegar. Ugh. Side note, by the way, Damien was described as having silver hair and, following his resurrection, red eyes. So I have to ask, what is it with edgelord characters in the albino look? I've noticed this quite a few times where an edgy character is also an albino. Is there some kind of connection? I'm aware of Elric of Melnibone and the OG fantasy albino, but I'm fairly sure most of these guys that are making edgy characters probably aren't. But I digress. When I heard this character concept, there were concerns that I felt I had to raise after he finished his initial pitch. To be clear, I phrased these suggestions and accompanied each one with suggested alternatives. I wasn't just saying, your character sucks, and listing all the reasons why. But here goes. Firstly, I explained that Damien being so powerful before the story even started wouldn't likely fly in an actual game, since the idea that he was already a badass killing machine didn't leave the character with anywhere to go during the actual campaign itself. The experience of becoming more powerful alongside your party is something that I think is integral to D&D, especially for forming bonds between characters and players. So I suggested that Damien should maybe be more of a mid-rank blood hunter in his unit as a means of getting around this. This was related to the second concern I raised. There wasn't a clear explanation as to how Damien managed to avoid his uncle's coup. Was he smuggled out of the palace by loyalists as a baby? And if they did that, why would they apparently abandon their prince to live as a feral child? They could have raised him themselves, or at the very least left him in an orphanage. The guy then said that he escaped himself, to which I replied that surely if this happened when he was old enough to escape, surely he'd remember something about his mom and dad. He apparently doesn't, so how does that work? One thing I also wanted to ask about but never got the chance to was how Damien can apparently 1v1 beholders and demons but not a group of guards. The math ain't mathing, Chief. But that never came about, because while I was suggesting ways to get around these concerns, I could tell that the guy was getting frustrated. As I said something to the effect of, you might want to sort these things out to make it easier on your DM to work the story into the campaign, I started to get the impression that he didn't like or couldn't take criticism. And this guy's defensive response was legitimately to just start listing things off that his character had done in his backstory. Not even seeming to pay attention to what I was saying, almost like he was in a trance. Some of the ones that I remember include Damien having a pet red dragon that he raised since it was an egg and uses as his personal mount. Not a drake, an actual dragon. 2. Him fighting in an outright invasion of his homeland by an orc army and turning the tide of battle single-handedly by descending from on high on his dragon and cutting down the orc chieftain and all of his bodyguards. 3. Love interests. Apparently, Damien has a hot girlfriend, and he literally described it as being like Batman and Catwoman's relationship, right down to his girlfriend being a career thief who uses a whip as her main weapon. He also said something about Damien rescuing a nobleman's beautiful daughter from a drow enclave that was raiding the kingdom's lands, wiping out the dark elves to the last man. He then brought the daughter back home, and they also began a romance, so he has a harem. All of this was obviously setting off a deafening level of Mary Sue alarms in my head. And while over the course of this conversation I was really starting to wonder what I could do with this, I decided not to give up. So instead of running the risk of making it feel like I was just picking holes in his idea, although I don't think that's what I was doing, I decided to ask him where he was planning for his character's personal storyline to go. Now, this got him excited again, and he went into a long and detailed description of how Damien would return to overthrow his uncle and reclaim his kingdom, including some very detailed descriptions about how his character would besiege the city with an army, fight his way through the castle single-handedly to find his uncle cowering on the throne, and after fighting and disarming him, he would drive his sword into his uncle's heart and send his soul to the 9 hells. Then, after becoming the rightful king and taking his girlfriend as his queen, I have no idea which one of the two he meant by this, by the way, he had an even higher goal in mind. Although his explanation wasn't so clear for how this would happen, he was planning for Damien and Belle to return to the 9 hells, regain Avernus from Zariel, and go on to overthrow Asmodeus and make themselves the new ruler of the hells. Now, I'm not a Forgotten Realms lore expert, so I'm not gonna say anything on whether that would even be possible. But over the top as it was certainly a fun idea. And I said as much, telling him, okay, that's actually kinda cool. I'm sure if it fit with the campaign you and your party were in, your DM could work that in. His response was, what do you mean? To which, over a bit of back and forth, I explained that usually in D&D, the DM will have the story of the campaign they're telling and will work in player backstories as they go where appropriate. That's how I do it, at least. Upon hearing this, the guy started to lose it. First in a confused, panicking sense as he tried to puzzle out that Damien wouldn't be at the center of the campaign. And then he seemed to start getting increasingly angry when I mentioned that other players would be tagging along. He might have to play through their characters' backstories as well, and how things might not go exactly as he wanted. For context, I ended up saying something to the effect of, sometimes in D&D, things don't go to plan. I've had a couple of situations where I've been, hell yeah, this is gonna be awesome, and then the dice just don't pan out, but that's part of the game. This didn't help though. He started raising his voice, saying that he was worried that the other players and characters would ruin his story, and that the dice might screw up what he had in mind. I tried to calm him down by saying that the other player characters in D&D are usually invested in helping the rest of their party, unless one of them is a real asshat, and that the different strengths of a varied party usually help make things easier and a party better at progressing the story. After all, I said, no character can be the best at everything, and that's when the shit hit the fan. This is when the dude started yelling at me, accusing me of calling his character a Mary Sue and ranting about how everyone he asks to look at his character ruins his ideas by wanting to change them. One bit I remember him saying after he accused me of saying Damien was a Mary Sue was, "If I hear those words one more time, I'm gonna explode." Mate, you said them, not me. But in all seriousness, if I wasn't trying to be constructive in my critique of Damien, I would consider him such. We have a character who is extremely overpowered for the situation he's in, wants to be the complete center of the entire narrative, played by someone who clearly sees this character as an extension of themselves. Not just having a couple of traits from their player to make them more relatable to others, or to help the player get into their character's head, which I think is absolutely fine, especially if you're playing a roleplay heavy campaign, but a character literally seen as an idealized version of themselves. No more, no less. There's an important difference. Anyways, after a long and uncoordinated rant about D&D now sounding stupid and wanting to find a different place he could use Damien, he left the call. So, yeah, that happened. In truth, I'm glad that this guy didn't end up joining my group if what he was expecting was for us to rewrite the entire campaign and the party to solely focus on him. And without a doubt, Damien is one of the worst characters I have ever personally come across. I've seen a few dark characters work in D&D before, my drow sorcerer friend and a few others included, but having heard plenty of edgy badasses like this over the years in other people's horror stories and now seen one for myself in the wild, it confirms a suspicion that I've held for many years. These people don't want to play D&D, a cooperative role-playing game. They want to play XX Cold Steel Lone Wolf XX's personal power fantasy. They want to be destroying every obstacle left, right, and center, without ever being challenged or expected to grow. They want to be seen playing a deep and complex character, despite not even coming close to meeting the requirements for either of those. And above all else, I don't think they even want to play a game. I think they just want to be the main character in their own story, where all the other players either don't exist at all or are just a captive audience to behold how awesome they are. Or rather, how awesome they think they are. That's one of the things that stuck out to me as a big difference between my friends who have played dark characters and people like this guy here. Should I have stuck it out for longer or just never bothered in the first place? I don't know. Was I foolish to expect more from this guy given that I knew what his writing was like? Most likely, yes. I guess I just try not to think that anyone is beyond improvement, so that's on me. Also, without wishing to turn this into an AITA post, part of me wonders if I might have crushed this guy's desire to play. I just didn't want to set him up for failure by making him think that D&D was going to be a solo game. I think what frustrated me the most about Damien's player was that outside all the obvious edge and wannabe badass energy he was attempting to put out, I could see a faint glimmer of potential. A character being manipulated by Bel to seek greater power so he could claim revenge and eventually pave the Archdevil's way into reclaiming Avernus could be a really cool personal storyline, provided if it fit the campaign. But that was the problem, if it fit the campaign. Whether this guy had done lore research on D&D and that's what got him into it without realizing how the game itself works, or if he did know and was just willfully ignorant of the matter, I don't know. But he clearly expected to be a part of a story tailored to his character and nobody else's. And I know at this point you're gonna say, mate, why are you even playing D&D? Just write a book. But the scary thing is, reader, he'll probably try. TLDR. Cringy guy with a background in bad writing makes a really edgy and overpowered D&D character. Asks me for feedback and gets annoyed when I suggest that some changes might need to be made. Then throws a tantrum and refuses to play when he realizes that the entire game will not revolve around his fun and his character. End of story. Okay, so taking criticism is the #1 way you will improve at literally anything. Even bad criticism has some kind of value because you can learn what kinds of people can add value to your craft and which ones cannot. But if in your head you've already perfected your craft and there's nothing else you can improve on, then, well, congrats on being the best in your own mind and objectively the worst everywhere else it matters. Now, the inability to take criticism is only one reason why Damien's creator is a bad writer. You see, a lot of bad writers have this habit of having their writing be based around themselves. That's why you see so many terrible stories that star flawless Mary Sues that just happen to be self-inserts for the writers or directors or whatever. A good writer will experience life through the lens of studying the perspectives of others. That way it's easier to write a story through the eyes of a character whose life experience differs from the author's own. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Damien's attitude was all me in regards to placing his character at the center of everything. Good writing serves the story. Bad writing serves the author. But, dear viewer, do you know what always kicks ass because it serves me? Fan art! That's right, how about we take a look at this week's Gallery of the Drake? This week's fan art comes from viewer Hidden Ability, who has depicted the Drake realizing that he's in over his head. Also, shout out to Lavender Fairytale for designing what the community has decided is now the canonical form of human Drake. I know a while back I mentioned I started doing MMA because getting punched in the face is the only way I can feel anything, so I guess this is what you guys imagine that looks like.
Larry, tag me out! Tag me out!
Oh, hell no, I'm not going in there!
Larry, that's what a tag team partner is supposed to do!
Ooh, that looked like it hurt. Tell you what, I'll go ahead and call an Uber to the hospital for you, partner. Thank you again, Hidden Ability, for submitting your art. If you'd like to see your fan art featured in Gallery of the Drake, be sure to send it to the email in my About section. Fan art is my favorite part of doing YouTube, and it means the world to me that I can inspire artists like you to create artwork like this. With the story over and artwork displayed, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you feel like supporting the channel further, my Patreon and merchandise links are in the description. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time in the Den of the Drake.